Since its release, The Joker has stimulated all kinds of commentary, and I want to throw in on this because I think there are some lenses that we can add to the discussion that help us understand a little bit more about what's going on in this movie. This is Anthony Metivier. Thank you for joining us. If you're new here, hit the thumbs up and get subscribed to this channel if you aren't already subscribed. We talk about movies in a philosophical way using the tool of genre primarily in order to unpack what's going on. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me is the discussion of this being a film rather than a movie. So we'll look at that a little bit as our first lens. And then we've got to focus on this whole notion of it being an indictment of society when actually it's talking about multiple levels of society in a way that's quite nuanced and complex. That lends itself to a discussion of the role of the individual versus groups, and is an individual even possible? I think there's a number of ways that the movie dwells on this and gives some interesting ways to think about that question. And then the role of madness, mental illness, and so forth as something that could potentially be very successful or as a downright failure. These things come into question. Then we have the idea of being a clown as something that's simple, but it's really just a simple way of codifying or giving an iconic representation to something that's quite complex. And then we'll talk about how that clowns are, somehow fake or an illusion or something like this, when in fact they're more like the real being expressed through the lens of illusion. So that's what we're going to talk about today and relate this to different genres, different movies, see how that works out. A lot of people relate this to the king of comedy, but I think that there are some other parallels that come out as well. That's absolutely a good parallel, but other ones I haven't heard being referenced yet. So we'll see if we can do that. Before we get started, thanks to our sponsor, and Genre Frameworks is a course that I was able to put together thanks to Magnetic Memory Method, the success of that. So I am the sponsor because Magnetic Memory Method is my main thing that I do on the internet to help people improve their memories. So if you want a course in how to learn and remember faster using memory techniques, it's what I used when I was getting my PhD. I wouldn't have been able to get my PhD without memory techniques because I was so damn depressed, and it was a great help to discover memory techniques and be able to finally sit in front of those committees at the dissertation defense and the field exams that preceded it and be able to just recite stuff off the top of my head, even though I was not feeling well at all due to lots of issues with that. So Genre Frameworks is a course that I was able to put together, and Magnetic Memory Method supports this work. So if you're interested in supporting this channel and getting a university level course on what genre is, all the links for that are down in the discussion below, and I think you'll like it. It's quite detailed. It's the equivalent of a 6-credit university course, and I think you'll enjoy. All right. So let's talk about movie versus film. And one of the first things that people keep saying is that The Joker is a film as opposed to a movie. And I think that that's true, but why is this coming up? And one of the things that people say makes a film versus a movie is an express concern, a tangible, noticeable concern with aesthetics. And so there's obviously a lot put into this aesthetically. However, I see a problem here because just about every attempt to put anything on camera has an aesthetic concern. So I'm not sure that that should be the thing that qualifies us to think of this as a film, and more so than ever before because of the education of cinema growing and growing and growing. And it's very, very difficult for people to avoid some sort of aesthetic gesture when they're putting anything on camera, especially when we know now, like the marketing of our cell phones shows us, and things like Instagram, etc., show us on our minds all the time that there is an aesthetic that goes into the capturing and distribution of any image. So I'm not sure that that's what qualifies it as a film. The auteur thing is interesting, though, because then there's the question of what the filmmaker wants versus what the audience wants. And you can certainly see that in terms of some of the conspiring and so forth, not in the normal use of the word conspiracy, but between the main actor and the director. So they talk a lot about how they'd still be shooting together today. And that is a signal of auteurism, because really when you look at what an auteur is, one of the things that I think qualifies that designation is that there are multiple situations in which the director has worked with a collective over time, and those actors appear again and again over time. And there's some evidence of that in this movie, not really as much as in a David Cronenberg film, for example, but something to consider. And I'm not sure that this qualifies it as a film, but if it were to qualify as a film, I think it is at the level of genre and at the level of the allusions to other films where we can actually start to unpack what's going on with a lot of multi-pronged references to other things. And so it sort of lands well in the soil, so to speak, of cinema, whereas other things, much to our discredit, we would just discount offhand, even if it was very, very aesthetic. So if you take a Transformers movie and claim that it's not aesthetic, that just doesn't work, because so much goes into the aesthetics of making such a film look like how it looks. And then if you look at Michael Bay and so forth, and a reliance on not only a cast and crew that would transfer from film to film, but many, many multiple technical professionals that work on the same films, etc. Well, it's hard to disqualify it on that sort of ground. But the extent to which there's a polysemy of potential references between Transformers and other entries into movies where your mind switches on and starts to do this Rubik's Cube, sort of switching through the dials of all the possible cinematic references and so forth. Not so much in something like that, and not for a lack of trying. So is it a film? Well, sure. But is the film versus movie debate even worth the time? Well, I don't know. But we spent some time on it, so I hope you enjoyed. I hope it gives you further food for thought. Now, in terms of society versus societies, I think it's very important to see in this movie that there's a hierarchy of societies going on. And so it's not one society. And that's part of the problem. I think we all feel it, even if we don't stop and say, well, we better make this multiple societies. But it really is a representation of multiple societies. So you have the lowbrow group, the middlebrow group, and the highbrow group. And if you really pick into this, you see that even there's a lot of hierarchies. So, for example, inside the clown world, the hired actor world, where you go and spin signs and etc., there's a hierarchy there. We see that in the beginning of the film, where there's power structures, and some clowns have more authority within this realm than others. We then see this even in the middlebrow world of, say, the Murray Franklin show, for example. So there, we'll talk about this a bit more. There's the Murray Franklin structure of the individual who makes decisions as the individual, and then there's him needing to deal with his production assistants and so forth, and there's a hierarchy there. And then in the highbrow world, where people are going to see Charlie Chaplin, which probably wasn't seen as highbrow, it's being represented inside of a very highbrow theater that has the columns out in front of it, and the rich people go there and they are very dressed in a very highbrow way. But even there's hierarchy, because all the rich people have servants, right? And so that's part of the dramatic tension in the movie, is that the mother of the character who becomes the Joker, he then is, she's the servant to the ruling class in the highbrow world. Even the comedic structure of the budding stand-up comic versus Murray Franklin has that sort of hierarchical placement. And it's also lowbrow, middlebrow, and highbrow in terms of entertainment. So the comedy from the stage in the club is sort of the lowbrow version of the middlebrow version of the Murray Franklin show. And then the Charlie Chaplin, at least in the present moment, when it's in that kind of theater, becomes the highbrow manifestation of what comedy can become if it evolves in a particular way. So that's very, very interesting. And then you have the hierarchies of the criminal world, so detectives, and the sort of way that Arkham Asylum maps onto and integrates with the medical establishment, but the medical establishment still being its own thing. It's a separate entity with its own rules and whatnot. And then you have the world of entertainment as something that is potentially criminal in terms of the theft of content. So, the stealing of footage of this actor or this budding comedian giving a presentation on the stage, winding up on television, shows these different societies, these different worlds, and then the crimes that go between them. So that's a very interesting part of the analysis. And in terms of thinking through societies instead of society, I highly recommend reading A New Philosophy of Society by Manuel de Landa. If you haven't read it, I think you'll find it very, very interesting for the theory of assemblage applied to multiple societies and the impossibility of a singularity. And part of the tension and the drama in this story is that there is always in humanity a sort of non-dual longing for connection with the whole, which is part of the matrix problem that we'll get to in a minute. Now, in terms of individuals versus groups, the first thing that I thought of, and lots of people have mentioned, is the Bernhard Goetz issue, which seems to be referenced to in the subway train and the shooting in the train. But it also has to do with different things related to how an individual must always be a representative of a group at some level, and how that groups are productive of at least the illusion of an individual. And what came to mind was the conspiracy song from Dead Milkmen, where it goes to pains to give all of these tensions between the surveillance society and how that it is productive of the things by which we are surveilled and through which we are surveilled and how we are going to be surveilled. So it says, they own our homes, they own our banks, we take out loans to buy them tanks, they own our children, they own our pets, they owned Elvis and Bernhard Goetz, they own our rugs and our flower pots, there ain't nothing they haven't got. They own the papers and the TVs, the waterworks, the record companies, and all of this is a conspiracy we have with ourselves. This royal they, only exists by virtue of our interaction with them at an individual level and our collective agreement and the games that we play in order to conspire with one another to make all this work, right? So it's an interesting reference to Bernhard Goetz in this song as just part of this larger wheel where an individual is produced by the society and then is either absorbed or shunned by the society, and it's all happening in this kind of one and the other accepting each other at different levels. So it's very interesting. And it reminds me of the broken windows theory, which is a criminological theory that basically one broken window in a society would lead to multiple broken windows. And if you were to clean up every broken window as soon as it happened, or scrub the graffiti clean as soon as graffiti went up, this would discourage further broken windows, further acts of graffiti, and those sorts of crimes. And this is a problem because, let's just stick with graffiti. Graffiti really is one of those things where it's against the law, except for the law enables it. And what I mean is that there is a world out there that is filled with advertising. There are signs on buses, for example. Now, you can find this irritating to endlessly see faces on buses. And I just saw one for, they're doing a theater production of Chicago, and there's this person laid out on the bus, and it's a very beautiful photograph, et cetera, to advertise this. But it's graffiti at the end of the day. It is someone painting something or applying an image to a public surface in a world that we share. But it's legal for it to be there because the law enables you to make a contract with the owners of buses, for example, and then place your imagery there. You rent it for a certain period of time, and then you have the right to place that imagery there. And then when that time expires, it has to be taken away, etc. But if I were to go there, or anybody were to go there and spray paint all over it, well, then it's a crime. So broken window theory is very interesting in that sort of regard when you look at it through that lens. as is a lot of the kinds of issues of the individual. So you're allowed to be an individual provided that you do it in a way that fits the customs, the laws, and those laws are actually productive and compel you to act in those ways. And it's okay as long as you stay within those boundaries. But if you were to get outside of those boundaries, well, you can certainly bet on a certain response in many cases, but sometimes you can't. And sometimes, as in the Bernard Goetz example, it will go in your favor for a while and then it'll go against your favor in a while. And as new details come in, it will shift the emphasis and so forth. And so that sort of law or principality of things is very fluid and subject to time, subject to the amount of information that's available at any given moment in time. It has an accretion of value. As the information comes in, it compounds what previous information was there, or it eliminates it, elides it, etc., etc. And so it's something to think about. I don't have a fixed conclusion on what this might all mean at the end of the day, but these are some of the lenses that come up to think about, especially when we think about the Joker as being an individual, and how that a lot of the different people who have talked about the Joker so far have, asked is he going to be the Joker that goes on to fight Batman, or is he the catalyst that inspires somebody else to eventually become the Heath Ledger Joker, etc., etc. And I find those speculations very interesting, but at the end of the day, what does it matter when the larger point is that we're being asked to look at the rules by which an individual is even possible in a society, and to what extent that when any sign of individualism shows up, it's actually accepted by that society or rejected. And so when this character is trying to be acknowledged by the person who he thinks is his father under those rules of society, he's absolutely not acknowledged. And there's different stories that clash, and we don't necessarily know which one is true at different points of the film. But when it comes down to brass tacks, it becomes problematic for everybody, really. It becomes problematic for everybody because it is pointing to a moment in time where a window got broken and something didn't get fixed quite right, which led to the next window being broken, etc., etc. And so theoretically, if the original mental illness in the Joker's mother's mind had been fixed correctly, then the son wouldn't have gone on to essentially perpetuate that. So I think that's an interesting way to apply the broken windows theory here, perhaps. Now, in terms of individuals versus group, one of the things that we see is a fatal flaw in the idea of the individual through Murray Franklin. So the movie makes great pains at the beginning when we introduce him to give him this exaggerated, grotesque half smile on his face. And De Niro does a great job of showing the wonky, very, very highly manufactured way that this kind of person in our world operates on the stage to essentially entertain people. And you think of Johnny Carson had his sort of way that he would step forward in a particular moment in his routines to anchor the laughter that it was generated by the audience. And so that people say he only had to step forward like that very briefly and people would laugh because he had so anchored it through that motion. And here we have this display of how Murray Franklin moves and so forth. So this constantly reasserts the idea that this is Murray Franklin, this is the Murray Franklin show, this is how Murray Franklin must move and behave, etc., in order to produce a certain effect, which when later he asserts his individuality, which comes at the moment when his producer is basically saying, yeah, getting this guy on with his makeup on our show is not going to go to a good place. Let's not do it. And Murray Franklin says, no, I think that this is good. This is fine. This is great. And so he green lights this Arthur Fleck guy coming on with his full on makeup and green hair, etc., to be on the show. And we have the sense there, we don't know for sure, but we have the sense that the very idea that the footage of Fleck doing his comedy routine that was stolen from, quote unquote, stolen as a intellectual content from his stand-up comedy routine, we have the feeling that that was a decision by committee. It is not explicitly stated, but it seems like that's the kind of thing that the committee that leads to the production of the illusion of Murray Franklin as an individual who shows up on this stage and commands the attention of the audience through certain movements that he makes and certain production things that happen there in the world of television talk shows. It's actually a thing that's decided by committee. And we know it is because everything's written down on cards for him to read, etc. The most individuality that he has is that he has a name and he looks a certain way, and he then is the person who goes through the motions to produce the effects. But in that moment, he says, it's okay, it's all right, I think this is good to have this character on. And that leads to him, spoiler alert, eventually dying. So individuality is seen very much as a fatal flaw, as it is with the Joker character, because his quest, his desire, his need to be acknowledged as an individual is the thing that cracks his skull ultimately when his father refuses to recognize him as a particular kind of individual in a particular segment of society and a particular world, right? So it really breaks down there in a pretty painful way. The other thing that leaps to my mind is the choice to have the old logo of the Warner Brothers company at the beginning, which really made me think a lot about Clockwork Orange and how that the individual versus group dynamic plays out there. So there's a social experiment in that movie where he basically decides to be conditioned against his desire to be criminal, and then he unfortunately also becomes conditioned to get very ill when he listens to his favorite music. And but he has this desire at a certain moment to actually get over that problem or to get out of prison. We're not exactly sure, but it seems that he pays a much bigger price. And we have this in the Joker. He wants to go and be helped by society. He wants to take his medicine, etc. He goes to these things to talk. He's maybe not entirely compliant, but he's compliant enough. He's playing along with the game. He wants to have his job. He's very concerned when his job is threatened. And ultimately, it's the society that breaks down. It's the group that breaks down and fails the group dynamic that really is supposed to support him as being part of a group, not an individual. And likewise in Clockwork Orange. So that's a reference that came to my mind much more than King of Comedy. And other references that came to mind were things like Carlito's Way and Scarface, for that matter, the De Palma movies. And those both had Al Pacino. And it's a similar sort of thing where an individual is relying on certain aspects of society to work, and they don't. And so then that leads to a kind of final chaotic end. Now, that leads us to madness and that question as a failure or success, because some people see the Joker as being very successful and they wear the same mask and they use that as a catalyst to go out and create all kinds of chaos in the world. And obviously other segments of society see this as quite harmful and bad, and there are some detectives essentially trying to arrest the character before another crime could occur, or at least get him for the crime that they think he's guilty of, and that doesn't work out. But when I think of this, I think of Gilles Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, where one of the points they make there is that really the designation of being ill is a lack of ability to contribute to society. And so one of the things that you can ask yourself and think here is, which contribution was Fleck making to society, and where exactly does that break down? And is there perhaps a deeper analysis to be made here with something like the tools from Nietzsche in Birth of Analogy, where you have an Apollonian order and a Dionysian disorder, and those two things need to be in balance in order for anything to happen to flow. And if they get out of balance, then they start to break down, which is similar to the territorialization and deterritorialization that is throughout the works by these two fine philosophers. So, you can think through that lens as well. And I'm not sure if it's a failure or a success, but given the role of this movie as not really an origin story, but rather a search for an origin story, what origin we find for the Joker, and as indeterminate as it may be, really does beg the question of, is his project a success or a failure? Or is it just purely Dionysian and decadent and, fin de siècle and so forth? We're not really in the right time period for it to be the latter, but it has those certain characteristics, especially now when we're 100 years ahead of the beginning of the world wars. So it's something to think about there. Now, in terms of simplicity and the harms of simplicity, this whole idea of clowns as being, we are all clowns, we see at some point in the movie. Someone holds up a sign. And this is interesting because a clown is a simplification of very, very complex emotions: happiness, sadness, disappointment, revenge, etc., especially the deeper into mime that you push it. And it can be so extraordinarily complex, the levels of emotion that are expressed through this simplicity. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that Arthur Fleck is actually good at his job at the beginning. He's very skilled at spinning that sign and dancing. His moves are not at all amateur or anything like that. And some people in their analysis have shown that, in the beginning he walks with a limp, and then he gradually is able, as he goes down the stairs, which we'll talk about in a minute, is able to move with some real style and real grace as he essentially becomes like the Murray Franklin character in some sense, or moves toward the role by which he will have this sort of changing of the guard with Murray Franklin. I think he starts off incredibly skilled, and he's doing what he can to contribute to society and so forth. And it's not simple. There's a piano player who's making very nice music that's not simple, and we see the skill of that. We see the skill of spinning the sign and the skill of getting people to pay attention on a very complex street, very busy, lots and lots of competing signs in the world, or graffiti, as the case may be, legalized graffiti. And so I think that we do harm to the nature of the clown itself as an image by thinking of it as a simplification, thinking of it as an illusion, etc. And that it goes back to that sort of problem of thinking of this in terms of mental illness, and really what is mental illness other than an inability to contribute to society based on the rules that society has put up for us and the conditions by which any sort of contribution is verified and so forth in a capitalistic exchange of value structure. So that's a problem, and especially a problem when his job is to contribute to society in such a way that people are encouraged to buy, essentially, within that system. So if we take that previous lens we were talking about as useful, then we can see that this is an interesting complexity through the guise of a seemingly simple expression of emotion in the form of a clown. And then later we see that sign, we are all clowns. Now, in terms of the fakeness of clowns, the illusion of these emotions going through the makeup and so forth, I think a lot about The Matrix and the character of Agent Smith, where his real struggle is the realness of the fake. And he really nails it in the first movie when he says, I hate this place, this zoo, this prison, this reality, whatever you want to call it. I can't stand it any longer. It's the smell, if there is such a thing. I feel saturated by it. I can taste your stink, and every time I do, I fear that I've somehow been infected by it. So how is that possible when the character knows that none of it's real? Well, that's because there's nothing that isn't real. Anything that comes into your consciousness and awareness, as long as you're fixated on it and focused on it, it is real, right? Because your brain is produced by chemicals, and those chemicals can't have experiences that are not either produced by those chemicals or somehow changing those chemicals as they come into contact. So this whole idea of, and I've just seen this in a lot of commentary and criticism, that there's this fakeness of society, this illusion of society. No, I don't think so. The whole problem is that everything that comes into someone's consciousness is real. And so whether the Joker is just lost in fantasy for so much of this movie or not doesn't reduce the realness and the consequence of those fantasies, which is what we see here. And whether the Joker is either really going to become the Joker that meets Batman one day, or he's just the catalyst for the person who becomes the person who fights with Batman one day or not, doesn't really matter. The clown face is not a symbol of inauthenticity that reveals something about society as a singular thing or not. It's really just pointing to the fact that, as Agent Smith notices, whatever comes into my consciousness, whatever invades my consciousness, whatever irritates my consciousness is real enough to be annoying. I don't like it, and I fear that I've somehow been infected by it. And that sort of gets to the way that the movie has its culmination in this sort of you get what you deserve moment at the end, because this character has been infected by the hierarchies in society, in societies, and the Murray Franklin character comes to be a portal or a path by which he can express a certain revenge that obviously points to the rejection of the father, because Murray Franklin is a kind of representation of his father in comedy, his father in entertainment, in those realms and in the middle brow, whereas we know as an audience that the Charlie Chaplin thing is also a kind of figurative father, but not the kind that would get killed, and certainly not the kind that this character would necessarily want killed, even though as he goes more and more insane, anything that comes into consciousness that irritates him, which, as we see in the Heath Ledger movie, seems to be just about anything in the world as such, then, this destruction carries on and on and on as more and more irritation comes in and in and in. So it's kind of like a Agent Smith problem in its way. Now, in terms of that realness becoming more and more irritating, I think we need to really pause upon the staircase and its role as a kind of inverse heaven, purgatory, hell situation. So typically when we have these sort of storied structures, heaven would be on the top, hell would be on the bottom, and purgatory would be in the middle. And certainly in this movie at certain times, that is basically how it symbolically plays out and represents itself. But one might think of the wonderful, wonderful Paradise Lost by John Milton and Satan's essential decision, which is that the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven, and it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So as this character goes down those stairs, he essentially does this. He decides to make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. And so that's how it plays out. Murray Franklin's show had been his heaven. It had been so essential to him. And then it becomes a kind of purgatory that then leads out to the hellish nature of the world, which is symbolically at the bottom of these stairs. And he essentially becomes its ruler. And we know that his reign is always temporary, as would Satan's be in so many stories. But nonetheless, he's always coming back. He's always making a gambit, making a bet that maybe the next time we'll take over the show permanently. All right, so I hope you enjoyed some of these analyses. Obviously, is only just opening the door of the things to be discussed about this movie and others. And I think that it's a pretty cool movie or film, whatever you want to call it. And thanks again to our sponsor for this video at the Magnetic Mary Method. And if you're interested in the Genre Frameworks course that I was able to create thanks to that initiative, then all the information for that is down below, along with some other resources. Thanks for watching, and until we have a chance to speak again, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're not already subscribed, and we'll see you soon.